I bought the cheapest Bugatti Veyron in the world, but there's one big problem with it. It's not the fact that it's in two pieces, it's because the gearbox is...
Mark McCann stared at his broken Bugatti Veyron sitting in two separate halves inside the garage, and for the first time since buying it, even he started wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. The car that once screamed down highways at over 250 miles per hour now looked completely dead. The gearbox was missing. Carbon fiber panels were scattered across the workshop floor. Dust covered the leather interior while the exposed W16 engine sat disconnected from the rest of the car like an abandoned machine from a failed experiment. Most people would have given up immediately, but Mark McCann refused to walk away. Instead, he made one phone call that shocked the entire automotive world. He called Mat Armstrong, the U2 mechanic famous for rebuilding supercars everyone else considered impossible to save. Mat had already become legendary online for bringing destroyed Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and even crashed Bugattis back to life. If anyone could understand the nightmare sitting inside Mark's garage, it was him. But when Mat finally saw the Bugatti in person, even he looked stunned. This was not a normal rebuild project. This was a multi-million-pound hypercar completely torn apart, abandoned for years, and carrying repair problems so serious that even Bugatti themselves reportedly wanted nothing to do with it. Yet somehow, despite all the damage, all the missing parts, and all the financial danger, Mark McCann still believed this broken machine could become legendary again. And now millions of people online were watching to see whether this impossible gamble would end in glory or complete disaster. Long before Bugatti ended up destroyed inside that garage, Mark McCann had spent months obsessively searching for the perfect Veyron. This was not just another expensive car purchase. For Mark, owning a Bugatti had become a personal dream that slowly turned into an obsession. Every listing in the United Kingdom caught his attention immediately. He researched accident histories, repaint records, service documents, and previous ownership details. He knew which Veyrons had hidden problems and which sellers could not be trusted. The deeper he entered the Bugatti world, the harder the search became. Clean cars disappeared almost instantly because wealthy collectors moved incredibly fast. The remaining examples were either massively overpriced or carried suspicious histories that scared buyers away. Months passed and frustration continued growing. Then suddenly, everything changed with one phone call from his friend Ollie. A rare Mansory Bugatti Veyron had quietly appeared off-market. In the hypercar world, the word Mansory immediately creates excitement because the German company transforms already insane supercars into even more aggressive and exclusive machines. A standard Veyron was already incredibly rare, but a Mansory Veyron existed on another level completely. The real shock was the price. It was far lower than what a car like that should normally cost. In the Bugatti world, cheap almost always means dangerous. Cars worth millions do not suddenly become bargains without a serious reason. Hidden crash damage, catastrophic mechanical failures, or expensive legal problems usually sit behind deals like this. Mark understood that immediately, but instead of feeling fear, he became even more curious. He needed to know exactly how bad the situation really was. That curiosity eventually led him to Bugatti Manchester, where he asked one terrifying question. What would happen if the Bugatti needed a complete gearbox replacement? The answer completely shocked him. Around £300,000, just for the gearbox alone. Not the engine, not the entire car, only the transmission system. Bugatti explained how advanced the Veyron gearbox really was, engineered to survive over 1,000 horsepower while handling unbelievable levels of torque at extreme speed. Repairs required specialist facilities, factory-approved procedures, and engineers trained specifically for Bugatti systems. Most people would have immediately abandoned the project after hearing numbers like that. But Mark McCann did the opposite. The danger somehow made the challenge feel even more exciting. Soon afterward, he contacted independent hypercar specialists at Fauner Cars, one of the few workshops willing to work on disasters most garages refuse to touch. Unlike Bugatti, Fauner believed the gearbox might still be reparable instead of needing complete replacement. That small amount of hope changed everything. Suddenly, the broken Bugatti no longer looked impossible. It became a risk worth taking. Around the same time, Mat Armstrong's famous Bugatti Chiron rebuild was dominating YouTube. Millions of people were already watching Mat rebuild a crashed Chiron that Bugatti themselves had officially declared impossible to repair. The same network of specialists, workshops, suppliers, and engineers connected directly to Mark's Veyron project. Yet despite all the growing excitement, nothing could prepare Mat Armstrong for what he actually saw when he entered the garage and looked at the Bugatti for the first time. The car was physically split into two halves. The gearbox was completely gone. Dust covered every surface. Expensive leather had dried and cracked after years of neglect. Carbon fiber panels lay scattered across the floor like debris from a crash scene. It looked less like a hypercar and more like a failed experiment abandoned halfway through construction. But the deeper inspection revealed something even worse. Previous mechanics had apparently lied about repairing important internal gearbox components. Tiny metal fragments remained hidden inside the transmission casing, evidence of catastrophic damage that had never truly been fixed. Those fragments could silently destroy the gearbox over time if the car ever drove again. In simple terms, the Bugatti had been left to slowly die. Still, despite all the fear and uncertainty, Mark McCann pushed forward. He sold beloved cars from his collection, including his Honda NSX, BMW M3, and even his rare Ford RS 200, just to fund the project. Every sale hurt emotionally, but he believed the gamble would eventually be worth it. Now inside Fonger's workshop, mechanics continue slowly rebuilding the destroyed Veyron piece by piece, while millions of people online watch every update closely. Some believe Mark McCann is creating one of the greatest hypercar comeback stories ever documented. Others believe he has made one of the biggest financial mistakes in YouTube automotive history. But one thing is certain. Somewhere under bright workshop lights, the broken Bugatti still waits in silence, caught between becoming a legendary resurrection or a catastrophic failure nobody will ever forget as the rebuild moved further forward. Pressure inside the workshop began to grow even stronger for both Mark McCann and Mat Armstrong. The broken Bugatti Veyron was slowly being rebuilt piece by piece, but every step revealed new challenges that made the project feel even more uncertain. What once looked like a straightforward gearbox repair had now turned into a full investigation into the car's hidden history. Engineers discovered that some internal components had suffered far more damage than expected, meaning previous repair attempts were not just incomplete, they were misleading. That realization made everyone more cautious, because in a machine as powerful and complex as a Bugatti, even one incorrectly installed part can destroy everything within seconds. The W16 engine, one of the most advanced engines ever created, required absolute precision when reconnecting to the drivetrain. Every bolt had to be torqued perfectly, every seal had to be replaced correctly, and every system had to be tested repeatedly before any attempt at ignition could even be considered. Meanwhile, Mark continued to face the emotional weight of his decision. He had already sold some of his most meaningful cars, and now there was no turning back. Each visit to the workshop reminded him that this was no longer just a dream purchase. It had become a long, expensive battle between belief and reality. Mat Armstrong, on the other hand, focused on breaking the problem down into smaller technical challenges. That was his strength. Instead of thinking about the entire car, he concentrated on individual systems: transmission, hydraulics, electronics, and structural alignment. Step by step, he tried to rebuild logic from chaos. But even for him, the Bugatti was different. It was more advanced, more expensive, and more unforgiving than most cars he had ever worked on. Progress was slow, and sometimes it felt like the project was moving forward only to fall back again after every inspection. Yet despite all this, the workshop team refused to give up. There was still belief that the car could run again, even if no one could confidently predict when. Outside the workshop, the online world continued to follow the story closely. Every update was analyzed by car enthusiasts, mechanics, and fans who were fascinated by the idea of an abandoned hypercar being brought back from near destruction. Some believed the rebuild would succeed and become legendary. Others thought the damage was simply too severe and too expensive to justify. But inside the workshop, none of those opinions mattered. All that mattered was whether the next part would fit, whether the next system would work, and whether the next test would finally bring the Bugatti one step closer to life again. And as the weeks passed, one question remained unanswered. Would this machine ever roar again, or was it destined to remain a silent monument to one of the riskiest automotive gambles ever made? As the final stage of the rebuild approached, tension inside the workshop reached its highest point yet for both Mark McCann and Mat Armstrong. The once shattered Bugatti Veyron was now slowly taking its full shape again, but it still carried the scars of its past damage. Panels had been reattached, the gearbox system had been rebuilt, and the W16 engine was finally sitting back in place where it belonged. However, nothing about this moment felt safe or guaranteed. Every component had to be tested repeatedly because even a single hidden fault could destroy everything in seconds. The workshop was quieter than usual, not because the work was finished, but because everyone understood how serious the next step would be. This was the moment where theory became reality, where thousands of hours of rebuilding would either come alive or collapse instantly. Mark stood nearby, watching every movement carefully, trying to control his emotions while remembering everything he had sacrificed to reach this point. His mind kept going back to the cars he had sold, the money he had spent, and the risk he had taken without knowing the outcome. Mat Armstrong, although experienced with difficult rebuilds, also felt the pressure. He knew Bugattis were not forgiving machines. They required perfect execution, not guesswork. Every system had to communicate correctly with the next, and every electronic signal had to respond without delay. When the ignition process finally began, the entire workshop focused on the car. There was a long pause as systems powered on one by one. Lights flickered, electronics activated, and diagnostic systems began running checks across the vehicle. It was the most critical moment of the entire project. Then came the attempt to bring the engine to life. The first sound was not a roar, but a hesitation. The engine turned slowly, as if waking up after years of silence. For a moment, nobody spoke. Everyone waited, listening carefully for signs of success or failure. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Then, gradually, the W16 engine began to respond more clearly. Mechanical sound strengthened, system stabilized, and the Bugatti started to show signs of life again. It was not perfect, and it was not fully complete, but it was alive. After everything, after all the damage, all the uncertainty, and all the financial risk, the machine had finally responded. Mark stood still for a moment, taking in what had just happened. It was not just a mechanical victory. It was a result of obsession, risk, and belief pushed to the absolute limit. Mat also understood the significance immediately. He had seen many rebuilds, but very few moments felt like this. This was not just fixing a car. This was bringing something back from complete destruction. Outside the workshop, the story was far from over. But inside, one thing was now certain. The Bugatti Veyron had not ended its journey in that garage. It had found a second chance at the final stretch of the story. The atmosphere around the workshop changed completely for both Mark McCann and Mat Armstrong as the rebuilt Bugatti Veyron moved from project status into something dangerously close to reality. After the first signs of life from the W16 engine, the focus shifted from whether the car could start to whether it could survive properly under real conditions. Every system had to be validated again under load, not just at idle. That meant checking gearbox response, throttle mapping, cooling performance, and electronic stability systems that control the entire hypercar at extreme speed. Even a minor imbalance in any one of these systems could turn an entire rebuild into a failure after all this effort. Inside the workshop, the team worked with extreme caution. Nothing was rushed anymore. Every bolt, every seal, every sensor was double-checked because everyone now understood what was at stake. Mark spent most of his time quietly observing rather than speaking. He had already gone through the emotional peak of ownership and sacrifice, and now he was living to the most stressful part, waiting to see if the risk had truly paid off. Mat Armstrong, meanwhile, treated this phase like a controlled test rather than a celebration. In his experience, many rebuilds look successful at first startup, but fail later when stress increases. That is why the real judgment of a project like this does not come from ignition. It comes from consistency. As the Bugatti began to run more smoothly, small improvements started appearing. Gear engagement became more stable. Electrical warnings reduced. Mechanical sounds that once suggested damage began to normalize. The car was slowly adapting back to life. But even then, nobody called it finished. Hypercars like the Veyron demand perfection, not partial success. Outside the workshop, interest in the project continued to grow rapidly. The idea that a completely split, abandoned Bugatti could return to life fascinated the automotive world. It represented something bigger than just engineering. It represented a belief that even the most expensive failures can sometimes be reversed with enough skill, patience, and money. Still, uncertainty never fully disappeared. Everyone involved knew that one final test drive would decide everything. That moment would reveal whether the gearbox rebuild, the engine recovery, and all the painstaking reassembly work had truly succeeded, or whether hidden damage still remained. As the day of that final decision approached, silence returned to the workshop in a different way. Not fear this time, but focus. Because everyone understood that very soon, the Bugatti Veyron would either complete its impossible comeback or expose every hidden weakness left inside. In the final moment of truth, both McCann and Mat Armstrong stood quietly as the fully rebuilt Bugatti Veyron was prepared for its first real test outside the workshop. This was no longer about repairs or theory. This was the point where the car either proved itself or failed in front of everyone watching. The engine had already shown signs of life, but now it needed to perform under real driving pressure. The gearbox, once considered the biggest failure point, had been carefully rebuilt and reinstalled. Every fluid had been replaced, every system checked, and every electronic control unit reset and recalibrated. Still, nobody inside the workshop was completely relaxed. Machines like this do not forgive uncertainty. One mistake at this stage could undo months of work in seconds. Mark stood slightly behind the car, watching every movement, clearly trying to stay calm but unable to fully hide the tension in his expression. This was a result of everything he had sacrificed. Every car sold, every risk taken, every sleepless night thinking about whether this project would succeed or collapse. Mat Armstrong approached the car with a more technical mindset, focusing on sound, response, and behavior rather than emotion. He had seen rebuilds succeed and fail many times, and he knew the first drive was where truth always revealed itself. As the Bugatti slowly rolled out, the atmosphere changed completely. The sound of the W16 engine echoed differently outside the workshop, no longer confined, no longer static. It felt alive, even if not perfect. The gearbox responded during low-speed movement, shifting carefully as the car began to move under its own power again. For a brief moment, everything seemed stable. The steering was responsive, the suspension held firm, and the electronics remained steady. It was not a high-speed run yet, but it was enough to confirm that the rebuild had reached a critical milestone. The car was functional again. Not perfect, not fully proven, but alive and moving. Mark's expression changed as he realized what he was seeing. The risk, the money, the emotional weight, all of it had led to this fragile success. Mat, however, remained focused, knowing that final validation would only come after more distance, more stress, and more testing. Still, even for him, this moment carried meaning. Few projects ever reached this stage after being declared nearly impossible. As the Bugatti returned to workshop under its own power, silence fell again, but this time it was different. It was not doubt, it was understanding. The impossible had not only been attempted, it had been achieved, at least for now. And whether this story would end in triumph or future failure, one thing was already clear. This broken hypercar had already been brought back farther than almost anyone thought possible.